Do you get annoyed when things don't go according to plan? I do. Sometimes I get up in the morning with a pretty clear idea of what I'm going to do for the day. Then something gets in the way and I get a bit annoyed. Maybe it doesn't last all that long, but it does show sometimes. It's not good. The Apostle Paul had his plans thwarted at least 8 times. The first time was on his way to Damascus. This was before he was converted. He was going to Damascus to arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem for the priests to deal with. Jesus stopped him in his tracks with an intense light that literally blinded him. I don't know the order in which some of the other things happened, so let me call the next one number 2. We read about it in Acts 16. Paul and his companions were on the second missionary journey. They tried to get into Bithynia, but we read that the Spirit of Jesus prevented them and sent them to Macedonia instead. Number 3 is recorded in chapter 2 of the first letter to the Thessalonians. Paul was writing to the Thessalonians and he said, "We wanted to come to you, but Satan blocked our way." Numbers 4, 5 and 6 are recorded in Romans chapter 1. Paul is writing to the Romans and he says, "I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now." He planned many times, he said, and that means at least 3 times. And that's why I'm calling these numbers 4, 5 and 6 of the plans that were thwarted. Number 7 is recorded in Romans chapter 15. Paul tells the Christians in Rome that he intends to visit them on the way to Spain. Well, he did visit them, but not on the way to Spain. He never got to Spain, because he visited Rome more or less under arrest in the custody of Roman guards, and he stayed there. Number 8 is recorded in the second letter to the Corinthians in chapter 1. Paul is apologising to the Corinthians for not visiting them. They knew that his plan had been to visit them. Twice, Paul now says, "I wanted to visit you, once on the way to Macedonia and once on the way back." But he didn't visit them. Paul had originally planned it, but he thought better of it. Something had happened. Some news had reached Paul about what was happening at Corinth, and he explains to the believers that it was better for them that he hadn't visited. There are probably more examples of Paul's plans being thwarted, but that's certainly enough for now. Let's stick with the Corinthians incident, though. To be fair to Paul, he'd already warned the Corinthians that things don't always go according to plan. His apology, which I just read bits of, is in the second letter. But at the end of the first letter, he'd set out his plans. In writing to them, he said, "I will be going through Macedonia. Perhaps I'll stay with you for a while, or even spend the winter. I hope to spend some time with you, if the Lord permits." And those are the key words, the last 4. If the Lord permits. Paul was well aware that the best laid plans don't always work out. They were always subject to what the Lord wanted done, not necessarily what Paul wanted. And he was consistent about this. We read about the end of his second missionary journey in Acts 18. The last place he visited on that journey was Ephesus. The Jews in Ephesus wanted Paul to stay there a bit longer, but Paul, he had to be off. As he left, he said, "I'll come back if it's God's will." Then he set sail. If it's God's will, he said, only then will I come back. It's James that tells us how we should do all our planning. This is what he said in the letter he wrote. Now, listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. It's no use getting cross when our plans don't work out. Did we commit our plans to the Lord in the first place, like Paul did, like James tells us to do? I'm afraid I don't, and that happens quite often. Even if we do commit them to the Lord, he may have other ideas. Paul knew that, and I guess we should be more aware of it than we often are. The Lord may have other ideas, for it's the Lord who is in charge of what happens to us. And he's the one who should be in charge of what we do with our lives and the plans that we make. He knows what's best. Some of you who are watching will remember a time when the Lord changed the direction you were going in. At the time you might have felt a bit frustrated, but afterwards you realised it was all for the best. That certainly happened to me.